They found the napkin 3 years after the war ended, pressed between the pages of a tactical manual that had been gathering dust on Marin Sable's desk since the morning she resigned her commission. The napkin was thin, translucent where coffee had once bled through it, and on it, in pencil that had smudged but never quite disappeared, were 3 characters, QD3, a queen move, not an attack, not a defense, a positioning that, to anyone unfamiliar with the game, would have looked like nothing at all. But 300 billion Veilshi had stopped fighting because of those 3 characters. And nobody outside of Marin's bridge crew understood why. The story that follows is the one the crew told in fragments, across depositions and retirement speeches and late-night conversations that always circled back to the same question. How did she know? She didn't. That was the answer none of them wanted to hear. Marin Sable had been playing chess since she was 4 years old. Not competitively, not with ambition, not because anyone had told her she was gifted. She played because the 64 squares were the only place in the universe where she could feel the shape of what came next. Her father, a cargo loader at the Meridian shipyards, had taught her the rules with a set made of stamped tin. The pieces were dull and slightly too light. The board was cardboard that had been folded and refolded so many times the center crease had softened into a valley. She remembered the weight of the queen in her fingers barely there, like holding a breath. She remembered the way her father would set the pieces back after she won, not upset, just patient, and say, again. By the time she was 11, she could beat anyone on the station, not just other children, the dock supervisors who played on their lunch breaks, the navigational officers who thought they understood spatial reasoning, the retired merchant captain 3 decks up who claimed he had once drawn against a ranked player on Earth. Marin beat them all, and she beat them quietly, and when they asked her how, she would look at the board for a long time and then say, I don't know, it just looks like that. By 14, she had stopped playing humans entirely, not because they were too easy, though they were, but because the look on their faces when they lost made her stomach hurt. The retired merchant captain, after his 7th consecutive defeat, had pushed the board away and said, You don't play like a person. You play like the board is thinking through you. He had meant it as an insult. Marin had heard it as the most accurate description anyone had ever given of what happened inside her head when the pieces were in front of her. She didn't want to make people feel small. She wanted to make the board feel large. She played alone after that. Her father noticed but did not comment. He had been a quiet man his entire life, and he understood, in the way that quiet people sometimes understand things that louder people miss, that his daughter was not lonely. She was calibrating. She would set up positions from historical games matches played on Earth 400 years ago, 500, 1,000, positions that had been analyzed and annotated and debated by generations of players who were all dead now. And she would sit with the board in the dim light of her cabin and try to feel what the players had felt. Not their strategy, their attention. The way their focus narrowed until the 64 squares were the only real thing in the room, and everything else, the room, the opponent, the noise, the world, became soft and irrelevant. She chased that narrowing the way other people chased company. It was not loneliness, it was precision. At 19, she enrolled in the Terran Naval Academy. Not to fight, to map. She was drawn to the strategic theory track, where fleet positioning and resource flow were taught through simulations that, to her, looked exactly like the middle game of a chess match nobody had bothered to study. Her instructors noticed her almost immediately. Not her brilliance, that word would come later, applied by people who hadn't been in the room. What they noticed was her stillness. When other cadets were cycling through projections and running probability cascades, punching numbers and arguing over force ratios, Marin would sit with her hands flat on the table and stare at the holographic map until her eyes lost focus. And then she would say something like, "Move the supply frigate to grid 19," and the scenario would unravel in her favor within 6 turns. Her simulation partner, a cadet named Paul Ennis, who would later serve as her communications officer, once asked her what she was looking at during those long pauses. "The spaces between things," Marin said. She did not elaborate, and Paul did not ask again, but he remembered it 15 years later when the Treaty of Corridors was signed and the phrase appeared in the preamble. She graduated without distinction. Her marks were acceptable, her conduct unremarkable, her fitness reports noted a tendency to ignore briefings she considered irrelevant, which was most of them. She requested a posting nobody wanted, strategic advisory aboard the survey frigate Dawnline, running long-range assessments of uninhabited systems in the Vale Reach. It was a backwater assignment, the kind of job they gave to officers who had no ambition or too many enemies. Marin had neither. She simply wanted a quiet ship with a good viewport and enough downtime to play correspondence chess with herself, which she did by writing moves on whatever scrap of paper was nearest napkins, ration wrappers, the blank margins of navigational reports, and leaving them in her pockets for days before responding. The crew of the Dawnline found her odd but harmless. She ate alone in the mess. She kept her cabin dark except for the small lamp over her chest board, and she had a habit of standing at the forward viewport for hours at a time, her hands clasped behind her back, watching the stars with the same fixed attention she gave the 64 squares. Captain Lun Hargraves, a career officer with 22 years of steady service and no interest in rocking anything, tolerated her eccentricities because her survey assessments were consistently the most accurate in the fleet. She saw patterns in stellar cartography data that the computers flagged as noise, and she was right often enough that Hargraves had stopped questioning her methodology. The Veilshi found them 7 months into her posting. The Veilshi were not conquerors in the way the term was usually understood. They did not arrive with demands or threats or declarations. They arrived with numbers. The Veilshi swarm, and it was a swarm, though the diplomatic corps would spend years trying to find a less inflammatory word, operated on a principle that predated their recorded history: saturation. When the Veilshi wanted a region, they filled it. Not with warships necessarily, though those came too. With bodies. Stations, habitats, seed ships, generation arcs, drone haulers, mining platforms, signal buoys, agricultural processors, waste recyclers, communication relays. They filled a system the way water fills a glass, not violently, not quickly, but with the patient certainty of a thing that has always been fluid and always found the lowest point. They did not conquer. They occupied. And by the time anyone noticed, there was no room left for anyone else. They had been doing this for 11,000 years. 11,000 years of expansion without a single declaration of war, without a single formal annexation, without a single act that any interstellar tribunal could classify as aggression. They had filled 914 systems across 4 galactic arms, displacing 47 species, and absorbing the territory of 12 extinct civilizations, and they had done it all without breaking a single law that existed at the time of each filling. No species had ever successfully contested a Veilshi filling. Not because the Veilshi were militarily invincible, they were not, particularly, but because there was nothing to contest. They broke no laws. They signed no treaties. They simply arrived, and kept arriving, and the mathematical weight of their presence made resistance feel absurd. How do you fight a species whose weapon is occupying the room? The first Veilshi contact with the Dawnline was not hostile. A swarm tendril of 11,000 civilian vessels transited through the system Marin's ship was surveying, and the Veilshi hailed them with a message that translated roughly as, "We are passing through. You may remain. You are small." It was not an insult. The Veilshi measured importance by volume. A single survey frigate with a crew of 41 was, to them, statistically non-existent. Marin watched the swarm tendril pass on the Dawnline's forward display. 11,000 ships. She counted them not as a tactical assessment, but the way she counted pieces on a board, by function, by reach, by the spaces they controlled. The civilian vessels were pawns. The escort corvettes were knights, moving in irregular patterns that covered the tendril's flanks. The communication relays were bishops, controlling long diagonals of information that stretched back along the column's path and forward into systems they hadn't reached yet. And somewhere in the column, she knew, there would be a queen, the coordination node that held the swarm's geometry together. She found it on the third pass of the display. A single vessel, unremarkable in size, slightly larger than a standard Veilshi cargo hauler, positioned at the geometric center of the tendril. Its hull was darker than the others, a deeper shade of the coral ceramic material, weathered by centuries of transit, the surface ridged with the mineral deposits that Veilshi vessels accumulated over long passages through interstellar particulate fields. It was broadcasting on frequencies that the Dawnline sensors couldn't fully decode: subsonic, low frequency, the kind of signal that carried not data but rhythm. The Filling's heartbeat. The pulse that told 11,000 ships where they were and where to go next, and how to move as one body through a void that they would, by the time they were done, transform into a presence. She wrote QD3 on a napkin from the mess hall and put it in her breast pocket. The pencil graphite smudged against the cheap paper. She folded the napkin once and pressed it flat over her sternum. Her commanding officer asked her what she thought. "They're not passing through," Marin said. Hargraves frowned. "Their trajectory says otherwise." "Their trajectory says what they want us to see. The relays they're dropping are permanent tanker models, Type 7 autonomous units with mineral root power cells. Those don't decay for 80 years. You don't anchor 80-year relays in a system you're transiting." She touched the holographic display, zooming out until the system shrank to a dot among 14 others. "They're building a lattice. This system is a node. In 3 months, there will be 40,000 ships here, and in 6 months, there will be 400,000, and by then there will be no legal framework under which we can ask them to leave, because they won't have fired a shot or broken a treaty." Hargraves stared at her. "You got all that from relay models?" "I got all that from chess." Hargraves was a good officer. Not a brilliant one, but good enough to know when someone in his crew was seeing something he wasn't. He had served with analysts before, the kind who ran probability matrices and cited confidence intervals and hedged every conclusion with 3 qualifiers. Marin was not that kind. Marin looked at a display full of data and said what she saw, and what she saw was either right or insane, and Hargraves was not qualified to tell the difference. So he reported it up the chain. The chain did not care. The Veil Reach was empty space, unclaimed, legally open to any species that wanted to settle it. The Veilshi were not signatories to the Terran Compact, but neither were they hostile. 47 diplomatic memos were exchanged over the following weeks, and every one of them concluded that there was nothing to be done and nothing to worry about. The Veil Reach was 18 systems of marginal value. Let the Veilshi have it. Marin played chess with herself and watched the lattice grow. She tracked it on a chart she had taped to her cabin wall. A hand-drawn grid of the Veil Reach's 21 accessible systems, with each Veilshi presence marked in pencil. The marks accumulated daily. By the end of the first month, 3 systems had Veilshi populations exceeding 10,000 vessels. By the second month, 7. She drew lines between the nodes, mapping the communication relay chains, and the pattern that emerged looked exactly like what it was: a pawn structure. An interlocking chain of presences that supported each other, covered each other's weaknesses, and left no gaps large enough for a challenge to enter. She wrote QD3 on another napkin and pinned it to the center of the chart. By the third month, there were 62,000 Veilshi vessels in the Dawnline system alone. The ship had been politely asked to relocate to a smaller orbital band, and then asked again, and then informed that the orbital band had been allocated for agricultural processing, and that the Dawnline's engine emissions were disrupting growth cycles. It was not a threat. It was a squeeze. The Veilshi did not squeeze deliberately. That implied agency, intent, a decision to pressure. They squeezed the way rising water squeezes the last air out of a sealed room. It was physics, not malice, and it was happening in 14 other systems simultaneously. Marin requested a transfer to strategic planning at Terran Fleet Command. The request was denied. She requested it again, this time attaching a 60-page analysis of the Veilshi lattice expansion pattern, which she had written in her cabin over 3 sleepless nights, mapping the swarm's growth against historical chess endgames in which a player with fewer pieces was slowly suffocated by pawn chains. The analysis predicted, within a margin of 2 weeks, the exact moment the Veilshi presence in the Veil Reach would become irreversible. She called this moment the Zugzwang threshold, the point at which any move the displaced species made would worsen their position, and the only viable option was to have moved earlier. The analysis was read by a junior aide named Tessic Varn, who flagged it as unconventional methodology and forwarded it to a committee that met once a month. Tessic did, however, remember the word Zugzwang because he had to look it up, and the definition a position in which any move a player makes worsens their situation, so that the obligation to move becomes itself the disadvantage, unsettled him in a way he couldn't articulate. He mentioned it to his supervisor, who mentioned it to the deputy strategic coordinator, who filed it in a folder labeled Veil Reach Low Priority, and forgot about it for 3 months. Marin took the napkin out of her pocket and looked at it. QD3. The queen move that looked like nothing, a positioning play, not an attack, not a defense, a placement that controlled the center of the board by threatening nothing and everything at once. In 1500 years of chess, it was the move that grandmasters feared most, not the check, not the sacrifice, but the quiet centralization that said, "I am here, and now every line of play runs through me." She put it back in her pocket and did something that was either the most reckless or the most precisely calculated act of her career. She requested a meeting with the Veilshi Swarm Coordinator, directly, without authorization from Fleet Command, without informing Captain Hargraves. She sent the request through the Veilshi communication relays, using a civilian diplomatic channel that technically any Terran citizen could access, and she signed it with her rank and name and nothing else. The coordinator's name was Orsh Tyvalan, a title name that translated roughly as the one who counts the filling. Orsh was old by Veilshi standards, which meant that the semi-translucent membranes along their thoracic ridge had begun to calcify into rigid plates, reducing their flexibility but increasing their resonance, a Veilshi marker of authority, since the calcified plates amplified the subsonic communication frequencies the species used for swarm coordination. The calcification gave Orsh's upper body a pale, mineral quality like old bone. Their 4 ocular clusters, each a tight grouping of 6 lenses arranged in a hexagonal pattern, tracked independent targets simultaneously, and when Marin sat across from them in the bright, daylit anteroom of the coordination habitat, all 4 clusters locked onto her at once. The anteroom was grown, not built. The Veilshi extruded their habitats from a biological substrate that hardened into a material somewhere between coral and ceramic, and the walls had the organic, ridged texture of something that had been alive recently. Light came through translucent ceiling panels that filtered the system's star into a warm, even glow. The air smelled faintly of mineral dust and something organic that Marin couldn't identify. The table between them was smooth and warm to the touch. "You are the small ship," Orsh said through the translation interface. "I am," Marin said. "You wish to remain." "I wish to play a game." Orsh's mandibles shifted a lateral grinding motion that produced a low, resonant click. The translator rendered this as mild confusion. "The filling does not play games. The filling fills." "I know," Marin said. "That's why I want to play." She pulled the napkin from her pocket and set it on the table between them. The 3 characters faced Orsh. The coordinator's 4 ocular clusters converged on the napkin, then diverged as each cluster independently scanned the paper from a different angle, then converged again on the pencil marks. "Symbols," Orsh said. "A move," Marin said. in a game my species has played for 1500 years. This move means I place my strongest piece in a position that threatens nothing directly but controls every line of attack in every direction. The move says, I am not attacking you. I am not defending against you. I am standing in the center, and now every move you make has to account for me. Orsh was silent for 11 seconds. The translator rendered this as processing. The calcified plates along their thoracic ridge vibrated at a frequency just below Marin's hearing, and she felt it in her teeth. You are one ship, Orsh said. 41 organisms. We are 62,000 ships. 9 billion organisms in this system alone. You cannot stand in the center of anything. I can stand in the center of the idea, Marin said. This was the moment. The crew would later argue about what Marin meant, and most of them would get it wrong, because most of them were thinking in terms of military strategy, which was only half the game. The other half was what Marin had understood since she was 4 years old, sitting across from her father with his tin pieces. That chess is not about the pieces. Chess is about the squares. The pieces occupy squares, but the squares exist whether the pieces are there or not. And the most powerful move in chess is not the one that takes a piece. It is the one that makes your opponent see a square they hadn't noticed before. Marin made Orsh see the square. She spent the next 48 hours in the Coordination Habitat's Dalit conference chamber, and she did not sleep, and she did not eat more than the ration bars she had brought in her jacket pockets, and she played a game that was not chess but was built entirely on chess. She mapped the Veilshi lattice expansion onto a 64-node grid, each node representing a system or a transit corridor, and showed Orsh how the filling pattern, the beautiful, ancient, self-replicating algorithm that had guided the Veilshi for 11,000 years, contained a flaw, not a weakness, a blindness. The filling pattern assumed that any space it entered was empty. It measured emptiness by the absence of mass above a certain threshold. And it did not account for spaces that were occupied by things smaller than that threshold. Marin's analysis showed that in 14 of the 21 systems the Veilshi were currently filling, there were objects below their threshold. Dormant relay stations from the Terran survey era, powered down but legally registered. Abandoned research outposts with active data licenses. Navigational beacons maintained by automated Terran systems that had been running for decades without human oversight. Microhabitats, single-module shelters placed by prospectors and explorers and forgotten. Seeds of presence that, under interstellar settlement law, constituted prior claim. The Veilshi had not noticed them. They were too small to count. You are not filling empty space, Marin told Orsh, and her voice was hoarse by then, raw from talking through 2 cycles without rest, and her eyes were dry and burning, and her hands were steady on the table. You are filling occupied space, and you did not notice because we are small, but the law does not measure importance by volume. Orsh's 4 ocular clusters had not left her for 48 hours. Their mandibles had stopped grinding. Their calcified plates were still. You cannot enforce this. I don't need to enforce it, Marin said. I need you to know it, because now every system you fill you will wonder, is there a beacon I missed, a relay I didn't count, a presence below my threshold, and every time you wonder you will slow down. And every time you slow down, the lattice loses coherence, and a lattice that loses coherence does not fill, it fragments. She tapped the napkin. QD3. I am standing in the center. I am not attacking you. I am not defending. I am making you see a square you didn't know was occupied. Orsh was silent for a long time. The subsonic vibration from their plates had ceased entirely, and the anteroom was so quiet that Marin could hear her own pulse in her ears. You are one organism, Orsh said finally. So is a queen, Marin said. The war, if it could be called a war, lasted 14 months. It was fought entirely in positioning, and it crossed 19 systems, and it was the strangest conflict in Terran history, because not a single weapon was fired and not a single ship was damaged. What happened was this: the veil she continued to fill, but they slowed. The idea Marin had planted that the space they were filling might not be empty acted on the swarm the way a grain of sand acts on the mechanism of a clock. It did not stop the movement. It introduced friction. The Veilshi began sending survey drones ahead of their seed ships, scanning for the micropresences Marin had described. They found some. In the Kelly's system, a dormant Terran relay station was identified 60 hours before a Veilshi agricultural platform would have settled directly on top of it. In the Seren corridor, 3 navigational beacons with active Terran licenses were detected in an area the filling algorithm had classified as void. Each discovery confirmed Marin's claim and amplified the uncertainty, and the Veilshi missed others. In the Jurassic system, a forgotten research outpost was found only after a Veilshi habitat had been erected within its registered operational radius, and the interstellar courts accepted Marin's legal challenge, and the habitat had to be relocated, not destroyed, not removed, just shifted by 14 kilometers, but the precedent was set, and the lattice trembled. Marin was transferred to strategic planning 3 weeks after her meeting with Orsh. Not because the command chain had suddenly developed respect for unconventional methodology, but because Tessic Varn, the junior aide who had flagged her analysis, read Orsh's post-meeting report, which the Veilshi had, characteristically, broadcast openly to every species in the sector, because the filling did not conceal, and realized that a single lieutenant on a survey frigate had done more to slow the Veilshi expansion than 6 months of diplomatic engagement. Marin arrived at the command station above Viridian 3 carrying her father's tin chest set in a canvas bag and wearing the same jacket she'd worn aboard the Dawnline, the napkin still in its breast pocket. She refused an office. She worked at a table in the daylit observation deck, surrounded by holographic displays she rarely looked at, writing chess moves on scraps of paper and staring out the viewport at the stars. Her colleagues found her unsettling. She never raised her voice. She never argued. She would listen to a tactical briefing, sit in silence for 3 or 4 minutes while everyone else debated force projections and supply line vulnerabilities, and then say something like, "Withdraw the patrol group from Sector 8 and send a single medical frigate to the Veilshi nesting zone in Sector 12. And when they asked why, she would say, "Because it's the move they can't account for." She was right. A medical frigate in a Veilshi nesting zone was the equivalent of a knight on an unexpected square. It didn't threaten anything, but it couldn't be taken without consequence, and its mere presence forced the swarm to recalculate their filling pattern around it. The Veilshi didn't understand medicine as a concept distinct from biological maintenance, so the presence of a dedicated healing vessel in their most vulnerable territory registered as something between a gift and a warning, and they couldn't decide which, and the indecision cost them 3 weeks of expansion momentum. 3 weeks from a single frigate, no weapons, no demands, just position. Her superior at strategic planning, Commodore Delis Hain, asked her to explain the logic behind the medical frigate deployment. Marin considered the question for 6 seconds, which was longer than she usually took, and said, "Think of it as a piece that occupies a square the opponent didn't know was contestable. The square isn't valuable in itself, but the act of occupying it changes the calculation for every other square on the board." Hain frowned. "I don't play chess." "You don't need to," Marin said. "You just need to understand that the Veilshi think in mass. Everything they do is about filling volume. When you place something in their territory that has no mass value but has legal weight, their algorithm doesn't know what to do with it. It's like putting a 0 into a multiplication sequence. The answer changes, but they can't see where the 0 came from." Hain approved her next 3 deployments without asking for explanations. The obsession deepened. Marin stopped sleeping in regular cycles. She would work at her table for 16 or 18 hours at a stretch, her chest set beside her holographic displays, the 10 pieces reflecting the cold blue light of the star charts. She moved pieces as she thought, not playing a game against herself, but using the board as an externalization of the Veil-She lattice, each piece representing a system, each square representing a state of occupation or emptiness. Her colleagues learned to read her moods by watching the board. When the queen was centralized, she was thinking. When the queen was off the board entirely, held in her closed fist while she stared at nothing, she was working on something no one else could see. She talked to Paul Ennis, her old simulation partner from the academy, who had been assigned to the command station as a communications specialist. Paul was the only person she spoke to voluntarily, and their conversations were brief and strange. "What do you see?" Paul asked her once late at night, when the observation deck was empty and Marin was sitting at her table with the queen in her fist and the holographic map glowing in front of her. "The board behind the board," Marin said. "The one the Veil-She don't know they're playing on." "What does it look like?" She opened her fist and looked at the Tin Queen. "It looks like every square is already occupied. They just haven't noticed yet." The journey from the Dawnline survey mission to the endgame took 14 months and covered 19 star systems. Marin traveled to 7 of them in person. She insisted on it. She said she needed to see the board, not the projection of the board, and her superiors indulged her because her results were inarguable, and because she was, by then, the only person in the Terran strategic apparatus who had ever made a Veil-She coordinator pause. In each system she visited, she did the same thing. She found the quiet place, the overlooked relay, the forgotten beacon, the microhabitat that the Veil-She's filling algorithm had categorized as noise, and she made it visible. She sent survey teams to document it. She filed legal claims under settlement law. She planted flags not on territory but on attention. She made the Veil-She see the squares. In the Orient system, she activated a dormant navigational relay that had been placed by a Terran prospector 40 years earlier. The relay's license was still valid. Its activation radius overlapped with 6 Veil-She agricultural platforms, and the legal challenge forced the swarm to adjust their filling pattern in the entire inner ring of the system. The adjustment took 11 days. 11 days in which the lattice did not grow. In the Basari system, she discovered that a Terran research outpost, abandoned 2 decades prior, had been cataloged by the Veil-She as mineral debris. She filed a restoration claim and sent a 2-person maintenance crew to reactivate the outpost's power cells and data uplinks. The outpost was the size of a cargo container. The Veil-She had 17,000 vessels in the system, but the container had a license, and the license had jurisdiction, and jurisdiction does not care about volume. In the Koloth system, the 4th she visited in person, she found something the Veil-She had already incorporated into their filling pattern without recognizing what it was. A Terran deep space monitoring array, dormant for 31 years, its solar collectors folded like the wings of a dead insect. The array had been placed by a Terran astrophysics consortium to monitor a pulsar in the adjacent system. Its data license was still active. Its operational footprint, though the array itself had not transmitted in 3 decades, encompassed a sphere of space 40,000 kilometers in radius. Inside that sphere, 418 Veil-She vessels had settled, including 2 nesting platforms where juvenile Veil-She were being cultivated in biological substrate tanks. Marin activated the array remotely. It took 11 minutes for the solar collectors to unfold and begin charging. She watched the process on her portable display, and she felt nothing, not triumph, not satisfaction, just the same fixed attention she had felt since she was 4 years old, the narrowing that turned the universe into 64 squares and made everything else go soft. The array began transmitting its identification signal, a standard Terran frequency burst that carried the consortium's registration code and the array's operational radius, and the 418 Veil-She vessels inside that radius received the signal, and their coordination network flagged a conflict. And for 27 hours the nesting platforms could not receive or transmit swarm coordination data because the Terran signal occupied the same frequency band. She did not gloat. She did not tell anyone what the 27 hours of signal disruption had cost the nesting platforms in coordination efficiency. She filed the legal documentation, noted the precedent value of the case in her personal log, and moved on. The napkin in her breast pocket was softer now, the coffee stain spreading into the paper's grain, the pencil characters beginning to blur at the edges. She did not rewrite them. The move did not need to be legible to be present. In the fifth system, Morena, she found nothing. No beacons, no relays, no outposts, no monitoring equipment. The system was genuinely empty, the first system she had surveyed that had no pre-existing Terran presence of any kind. The Veilshi were filling it without obstruction, and their lattice in this system was clean, coherent, beautiful in its mathematical regularity. Marin placed a single navigational beacon at the system's barycenter. One beacon, standard equipment, legally registered in the time it took her to fill out a 2-page form. Its operational radius was negligible, 700 meters. It did not interfere with any Veilshi activity. It did not overlap with any Veilshi claim. But it existed, and the Veilshi knew it existed. And for the first time, the filling pattern in the Morena system deviated from its predicted trajectory, because the swarm tendril that reached the barycenter paused for 9 minutes to scan the beacon before flowing around it. 9 minutes. In 914 systems filled over 11,000 years, the Veilshi had never paused at a barycenter. Marin had planted a thought, and the thought had weight. In the Thessaly transit corridor, she placed 3 new navigational beacons at mathematically precise intervals along the Veilshi's primary expansion axis. The beacons were standard Terran equipment, commercially available, legally unremarkable. Their placement, however, was not random. Marin had calculated the intervals to create what she called geometric interference, points of legal presence that, when connected, defined a lane of transit through the corridor that the Veilshi's filling pattern could not close without triggering a legal challenge. The lane was narrow, 200 kilometers wide, in a corridor that spanned 4 light minutes. But it existed, and it was registered, and it would not close. The Veilshi responded to each of these moves with increasing agitation. Not anger, the Veilshi did not experience anger in any way the translators could render. Something closer to revulsion. The concept that space could be occupied by something too small to count, and that the smallness itself was a form of power, violated every principle the filling had encoded into their civilization for 11,000 years. They were a species that had evolved to fill voids. Their language had no word for empty that was distinct from unfilled. The idea that a void could push back was, to them, not threatening but ontologically disturbing. It was as if Marin had told them that darkness was a kind of light. They hated it, and they could not ignore it. In 4 systems, the Veilshi attempted to accelerate their filling to preempt Marin's claims. In each case, the acceleration caused the swarm tendrils to overshoot their coordination thresholds, and the resulting disorganization created more gaps, which Marin's survey teams promptly documented and claimed. The harder the Veilshi pushed, the more squares appeared. It was, as Marin had predicted, a positional trap. The kind of trap that does not catch the prey, it makes the prey catch itself. In the Peller system, the 7th and final system Marin visited in person, a Veilshi sub-coordinator named Thenic Tyoral requested a direct meeting. Thenic was younger than Orsh, their thoracic plates still flexible and translucent, and they spoke faster than any Veilshi Marin had encountered, their mandibles clicking in rapid sequences the translator struggled to parse. "You are the one with the symbols," Thenic said. "I am the one with the move," Marin corrected. "What is the difference?" "A symbol represents something. A move changes something." Fennec's ocular clusters tracked her face with an intensity that felt different from Orsh's measured regard. This was curiosity, not assessment. We have filled 917 systems. No organism has ever done what you are doing. Our elders have no record of a resistance that uses no force. It's not a resistance, Marin said. It's a presence. There's a difference. Explain the difference. Marin thought about it. She reached into her pocket, but the napkin was in her jacket back on the courier, so she picked up a stylus from Fennec's table and drew 3 characters on the table's surface. QD3. The Veilshi table material was warm and slightly porous, and the stylus marks sank into it like ink into wet paper. Resistance pushes back, she said. It meets force with force. Presence doesn't push. It doesn't move. It occupies a position and stays there, and everything that flows around it has to acknowledge that it exists. Water doesn't resist a stone in a stream, but the water flows differently because the stone is there. The stone doesn't need to be strong. It needs to be present. Fennec looked at the marks on the table for a long time. The translator rendered no response. Eventually, Fennec said, "You have changed how we fill." "I've changed how you see what you're filling around," Marin said. Fennec stood and left without another word. 6 days later, the Veilshi presence in the Peller system began observing a voluntary exclusion zone around every identified Terran beacon and relay, not because a legal challenge had been filed, but because the sub-coordinator had decided, independently, that the pause was worth the cost. Marin noted this in her log but told no one. The pattern was spreading. The idea was propagating through the swarm the way the swarm itself propagated through space, not by force, but by filling the gaps in their understanding. By the 11th month, the Veilshi lattice had expanded to fill 19 of the 21 accessible systems in the Veil reach, but its coherence had deteriorated. The communication relay chains that had once formed an unbroken web of subsonic coordination now had gaps, small ones, most of them, but gaps that forced the swarm tendrils to route their signals through longer paths, which introduced latency, which slowed the filling's rhythm, which created more gaps. The lattice was still vast. It was still overwhelming, but it was no longer smooth. It had cracks, and in each crack somewhere there was a Terran beacon or a legal claim or a navigational registration that had been placed there by a woman who saw the board. Marin Sable sat in the observation deck and held the Tin Queen and stared at the stars and did not sleep, and when Paul Ennis brought her coffee, she said, without looking up, "I think I can see the end game." "How does it end?" Paul asked. "The same way every game ends," Marin said. "The queen holds the center and the pawns realize they can't advance without stepping into check." The endgame began in the Tessarine system, the 19th and final node of the Veilshi lattice expansion. Marin arrived aboard a diplomatic courier, alone except for a pilot and Paul. The system was already dense with Veilshi presence, 170,000 vessels, 32 billion organisms, the largest single concentration of the swarm outside their home cluster. The space was thick with them. The Veilshi habitats hung in clusters like geological formations, their coral ceramic surfaces catching the system's white-gold starlight, and between them the smaller vessels moved in slow, interlocking orbits that followed patterns too complex for the human eye to trace but too regular to be random. It was beautiful. Marin had never denied that. She had said so once, to Paul, on the courier's bridge, watching the habitats drift past the viewport like formations of living stone. The filling was beautiful the way a glacier is beautiful, vast, patient, and indifferent to the things it covers. And like a glacier, it was most beautiful from a distance, where you couldn't see what it had buried. Orshtai was there. Marin had requested them specifically. The coordinator had not communicated with Marin directly since their first meeting 14 months earlier, but the Veilshi broadcast network had carried every one of Marin's legal challenges, every beacon activation, every navigational claim, and Orsh had received them all. Orsh had been the one who, according to the Veilshi public record, had issued the first system-wide order for pre-fill, surveys the scanning protocol that had slowed the swarm's advance. Orsh had seen the square first. Orsh understood. They met in a daylit anteroom grown from the same coral ceramic substrate as the first one, though this one was larger, with higher ceilings and walls that curved inward like the interior of a shell. The light came from bioluminescent panels embedded in the habitat's organic walls, grown in patterns that mimicked the star system outside. The light was warm, golden white, steady, and it fell across Marin's face in a way that made her look older than her 34 years. She had lost weight. Her cheekbones were sharper. Her eyes had the dry, fixed quality of someone who has been staring at something no one else can see for so long that the staring has become the seeing. She set the napkin on the table, the same napkin. 14 months of being carried in a breast pocket had softened it further. The coffee stain had yellowed from brown to amber. The pencil had faded to a pale gray ghost of itself, but the 3 characters were still legible. QD3. You brought the symbol, Orsh said. I brought the move, Marin said. It is the same move. It has always been the same move. That's the point. She leaned forward. Her hands were flat on the table the way they had been flat on her father's cardboard chessboard when she was 4, the way they had been flat on the Academy's simulation tables, the way they were always flat when she was about to say the thing she had been thinking for days. One move, one position, and you have spent 14 months trying to account for it, and you cannot because the move does not change. The move stays. The move is patient. The move does not need to be a fleet or a weapon or a threat. The move is a position, and a position is an idea, and an idea does not have mass. So your filling algorithm cannot count it, and what you cannot count, you cannot fill around. Orsh's calcified thoracic plates resonated a deep, bony vibration that Marin felt in her sternum. The translator rendered it as distress. You have disrupted 17 systems. I have occupied 17 squares. With what? Beacons, relays, legal claims, containers and data licenses, things that weigh less than our waste processors. Things you cannot ignore. Orsh's mandibles opened and closed. The translator did not render a word. It registered the movement as an involuntary stress response. We could destroy them. Yes, Marin said, and then you would not be filling, you would be conquering. And a species that conquers is subject to the laws of war, and the laws of war are not measured by volume. They are measured by intent. And the moment you destroy a legal claim to clear space for your filling, your intent is recorded, and you are no longer a species that peacefully occupies empty space. You are an invader, and invaders face coalitions. She held up the napkin. The 3 characters caught the bioluminescent light, and the graphite remnant of the pencil marks gleamed dully like something metallic seen underwater. This is not a weapon. This is not a threat. This is a queen on D3. It controls every diagonal, every file, every rank that passes through the center. It does not need to move. It does not need to attack. It only needs to exist, and by existing it changes what you can do. You can still fill. You can still expand, but you will do it around me and around the idea of me and around the possibility that in every system you enter there is another square you didn't see. Orsh's 4 ocular clusters closed, one by one, a slow, deliberate sequence that started with the lower left and ended with the upper right, each cluster folding its 6 lenses inward like a flower closing. The translator rendered this as a decision made. What do you want? Orsh asked. Corridors, Marin said. In every system you occupy, a navigational corridor remains open and uncontested, free for transit by any species. You fill around it. You do not fill through it. The corridor is narrow. It costs you almost nothing. But it exists, and it is mine, and it means that no matter how full the glass becomes, there is always a channel of empty space that proves the glass was not empty when you started pouring. Orsh looked at the napkin, and if we agree to this, then the legal challenges stop. The survey teams withdraw. The beacons stay, but they go quiet. And I go home and I do not play this game again, because this game was never about winning. It was about making sure the board stayed visible. And if we do not agree? Marin said nothing. She did not need to. The Veilshi understood saturation better than any species in the galaxy. They understood that a single presence in the center of a system, unremovable, uncountable, patient, could disrupt a filling pattern the way a single grain disrupts the surface tension of a drop of water. Not by force, by geometry. And they understood something else, something that Marin had not said but that the napkin had said for her across 14 months, that the human sitting across from them would not stop. The beacons would keep appearing. The claims would keep multiplying. The squares would keep becoming visible, not because Marin was relentless though she was, but because the idea itself was relentless. Once you see a square, you cannot unsee it, and Marin had shown them how to see. Orsh agreed. The agreement was not instantaneous. It took Orsh 4 days to consult with the Swarm's Coordination Council, a body of 11 senior coordinators whose calcified plates resonated in harmonic frequencies that could synchronize the decision-making of billions. Marin waited in the anteroom. She did not leave. She did not contact Fleet Command. She sat at the table with the napkin in front of her and played chess in her head, visualizing games she had memorized decades ago, the positions flowing through her mind like water through the corridors she was asking for. Paul brought her food. She ate. She did not speak. On the 3rd day, Paul sat across from her and said, "You know they might say no." "They won't," Marin said. "How do you know?" She picked up the napkin and held it to the bioluminescent light. The QD3 was barely visible. Because the move is already on the board. The question isn't whether they agree to the corridors. The question is whether they realize the corridors already exist in every system where I placed a beacon, in every gap their lattice had to flow around, in every pause their swarm tendrils made when they encountered something they couldn't count. The corridors are already there. I'm just asking them to name them. On the 4th day, Orsh returned and said simply, "We will name them." The Treaty of Corridors was signed 9 days later in the same anteroom, where the agreement had been reached. It was witnessed by Paul Ennis for the Terran side and by Thenic Tyoral, the young sub-coordinator Marin had met in the Pellar system, now elevated to treaty signatory for the Veilshi. It was the shortest interstellar treaty in Terran records, 4 clauses, 11 sentences, a navigational chart showing the corridor routes in all 19 systems, and a preamble that included the phrase "the spaces between things," which Paul recognized and did not comment on. The Veilshi honored it completely. In every system they occupied, the corridors remained open. The lattice expanded, but with channels through it, like veins through tissue, like the empty diagonals on a chessboard that no piece occupies but every piece must respect. And those channels carried not just Terran ships but ships of every species that had been quietly squeezed out of the Veil reach over the preceding years. Marin resigned her commission the morning after the signing. She submitted the paperwork before the anteroom's bioluminescent panels had shifted to their daytime cycle, writing her resignation on a standard form with the same pencil she had used, 14 months earlier, to write 3 characters on a napkin. She turned down a promotion to full commander, declined an invitation to lecture at the academy, refused 3 interview requests from the Terran Historical Archive, and ignored a personal message from Commodore Hayne asking her to reconsider. She returned to Meridian Station, where her father had loaded cargo 30 years before, and she took a room with a viewport and a table and her father's old tin chess set. The pieces were still dull. The board was still creased. The queen was still barely heavy enough to feel in her fingers. She played correspondence chess with herself, writing moves on scraps of paper and leaving them in her pockets, and she did not talk about the Veilshi, and she did not talk about the Veil Reach, and when the corridors were mentioned on the station's news feeds, she would look at the viewport for a long time and then move a piece on the board. Paul Ennis visited her twice a year. He would bring coffee from the merchant quarter and sit across from her, and they would play chess, and Marin would beat him within 30 moves, and Paul would laugh and say, "I'm getting worse." And Marin would say, "You're getting more predictable, which is different." On one visit a year after the treaty, Paul asked her if she missed it, the work, the positioning, the 14 months of not sleeping, and seeing the board behind the board. "I missed the narrowing," Marin said. She was holding the tin queen, turning it between her thumb and forefinger. The way everything else goes soft when you can see the position clearly. The way the 64 squares become the only real thing in the room. She set the queen down on D3. "But I don't miss the board being full of someone else's pieces. I like it better when it's just mine." Paul looked at the board. The queen on D3. All the other pieces in their starting positions untouched. A game that had never been played, or a game that was always being played, depending on how you looked at it. "That's the loneliest thing I've ever heard," Paul said. "It's the most peaceful thing I've ever felt," Marin said. 3 years later, a historian named Dara Senek, cataloging the careers of notable Terran strategists for a university archive, found the napkin pressed between the pages of a tactical manual on Marin's desk. It was the only artifact Marin had kept from the entire campaign. No medals, no commendations, no copies of the treaty. Just a napkin with 3 faded characters and a coffee stain that had yellowed to the color of old parchment. By then, Marin was 37 and she lived alone, and when the historian asked her about the napkin, she held it up to the light from the viewport and looked at the 3 faded characters QD3, barely visible now, the graphite almost gone, the pencil marks more memory than substance, and said, "It's the only move I ever needed." "But what does it mean?" the historian asked. "QD3, why that move? Why that square?" Marin set the napkin down on the table beside her chess board. She looked at the tin pieces, at the queen standing on D3 where it always stood when she was thinking, at the 64 squares that had been the only place she had ever felt at home. "It means I am here," she said. "That's all it ever means. I am here, and now you have to decide what to do about it." The historian wrote it down, and the napkin went back between the pages, and the queen stayed on D3. And in 19 systems across the Veil Reach, the corridors stayed open. Not because anyone enforced them, not because a fleet stood guard, because the idea of a queen on D3 had been planted in the Veilshi collective awareness, and it could not be unplanted, and every time a swarm tendril reached a corridor and paused and flowed around it, the pause was the proof that the smallest move on the board could hold back the largest force in the galaxy. Not with strength, not with numbers, with position. The Veilshi would expand for centuries more. They would fill systems and regions and arms of the galaxy with their patient, ancient, beautiful saturation. But in every system they entered, they would carry with them the memory of a napkin with 3 characters on it, and a woman who had sat across from their coordinator and said, "I am here," and the knowledge inescapable, unremovable, planted so deep in their collective awareness that 11,000 years of filling could not wash it out, that the square was never empty. With the knowledge that someone somewhere had looked at the empty center of the board and understood that the square was not empty. It had never been empty. It had been waiting for the right piece. Marin Sable played chess alone in her room on Meridian Station, and the corridors stayed open, and the napkin held its 3 characters in faded pencil, and the queen held its square. Some things do not need to be large to be immovable.